All right. If you don't know me, I'm John Racanelli, member of the SABR Chicago chapter. I know a lot of your names. I've seen some of you. I've known some of you by email and phone calls. So it's kind of nice to put some faces with names today. But we are absolutely delighted to have Ralph Carhart here today to talk about his book. It's The Hall Ball, One Fan's Journey to Unite Cooperstown Immortals with a Single Baseball. If you don't know Ralph, he's a SABR member based out of Brooklyn. He chairs the 19th Century Grave Marker Project. And the book, which I finished reading earlier this week, is absolutely phenomenal. Um, as a result of his work on the Hall Ball, he was the recipient of the 2019 Hilda Award by the Baseball Reliquary. And basically, that goes to a distinguished fan who serviced the game. So, pretty cool. I know if you're like me, you kind of like numbers. That's what baseball is all about. In his book, Ralph indicates he drove over 20,000 miles, flew another 24,000 miles over the course of 8 years to get this book project completed. And the book itself is the culmination of that journey. It's part biography, part baseball history, part travelogue. And if you haven't read the book yet, I recommend it highly. I hope you can get your hands on it. The information on how to get the book is available at saberchicago.com. You could go also to the Hall Ball. You'll find Ralph easily enough on the internet too. From what I understand, if you want to get a copy directly from him, he'll autograph it, and that puts the most money in his pocket too, which is always important for an author. So you can find that way. During the presentation, I'll have the questions or the comments sections up. If you have a question, you want to post it in there, we'll try and get to everybody's questions. And at the end of the presentation, hopefully we'll have enough time that Ralph can answer some live questions too. So basically just speaking, Ralph, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your inspiration for the project was.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I was planning on giving you guys a little background. I know that some of you here already know the background of it, but I was planning on giving you guys some background because you need to know it to fully appreciate some of the things I talk about in the chapter I'm about to read to you guys today. But the project began in 2010 on a visit to Cooperstown when my wife and I were early for our dinner reservations. We had a little spare time. We were in town. We were trying to figure out what to do. And earlier that year, for Christmas the year before, my father-in-law had given us a genealogical book that he had been compiling on Anna's family for quite some time. My father-in-law, Bob, was big into genealogy. He introduced me to it, and I got hooked. I got hooked in part because his research revealed that my wife was a first cousin, I think it's 14 times removed, of William Shakespeare. And I'm a big Shakespeare fan. I have Shakespeare tattoos. I've been working professionally in theater for 25 years now, and as a manager and as a director. And my favorite things that I've always ever directed were Shakespeare's works. So when I learned that, it got me interested, and I got super hooked on genealogy, which, if any of you have ever done that kind of research, means spending a fair amount of time in cemeteries. So on this visit to Cooperstown, when we were early for our reservations, we decided to visit the cemetery that's located on the southeast corner of the lake there. And while we were there, my wife stumbled across the grave of Abner Doubleday. Now, it's not our Abner, the mythological creator of baseball. This one actually turned out to be his grandfather. Our Abner is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. But it got me thinking as to what it would take to visit all of the graves of the members of the Baseball Hall of Fame. Just what kind of journey would that be? Where were they all located? So I got home from our trip that weekend and I started doing my Google research. And within about 5 minutes, I stumbled upon the website of our friend Stu Thornley, who's here with us today. And I had discovered that Stu had already done that. He'd already gone on a trip to do that sort of thing. which was exciting for me because it, made it easier for me to locate the graves. Stu has this incredible website where he's got GPS coordinates and everything. But it was also a little discouraging to me because I do work in the arts and I do work in theater. And one of the reasons that I love working with Shakespeare in particular is because his work is so old. It's been done in so many ways that the challenge that I enjoy is finding a new way to tell that story. So I wanted to try and find a new way to tell the story that Stu had already told. And I decided that the way I was going to do that was that I was going to take a single baseball with me on my journey. And every time I went and visited one of these graves, I was going to take a photograph of the ball at that grave. And then not long after I started doing that, I decided why stop with just the dead guys and why not, try and include the living Hall of Famers as well, which is definitely an element of the project that simultaneously made it much cooler and also much more of a pain in the ass, because getting to the living guys is far more challenging than getting to the dead ones. But in the end, I was able to visit. I stopped at the end of 2018 when there were 323 members of the Hall of Fame, and I was successfully able to photograph 318 of them. There were 5 of them that I was not able to take photos of. I'll let you read the book and figure out who those 5 were. But you need to understand that little bit of background because of some references I make in the chapter. So you know that. The background on the book, I didn't start writing the book right away. I didn't know there was going to be a book when I began the project. It was just a fun thing for me to do. It wasn't until I was a couple of years in that I decided I wanted to write a book. And I did it. When I got started, I still didn't know what I wanted it to be. And there were probably 3 different versions of the book before I finally settled on the thing that McFarlane published last year. And there are, especially in the early chapters, of which the one I'm about to read you today, some echoes of that uncertainty of what I wanted the book to be. But what I ended up deciding on was something, John sort of described it to you a bit already. The book has multiple different angles. It certainly is a travel log, and it looks at some of the specific stories of the different trips that I made to finish the project. But as I was writing it, I sort of realized that sometimes there wasn't a story. Sometimes I just went and took the picture and that was it. There really wasn't a tale to tell. And rather than try and force a tale that didn't happen or didn't exist, I decided that some of the ways that I would fill the book out a little bit is that I would, not only, tell the biographies of the players themselves. And there's a little brief bio of pretty much every player in the book. I don't do in-depth bios. First of all, with 323 guys, if I got too in-depth, the book would have been intolerable. But also just that that's been done and that wasn't really the point. What I was looking to do, though, was not just look at those little bios, but I also have a particular fondness for the 19th century and the origins of the game and how it all began. So the other element that I decided to add as I was putting the book together was how baseball came to, when baseball came to the various states that I visited. And that's how the book is structured, is each chapter is a different state. Mostly, there's a couple of other chapters that look at different subjects. But most of the chapters are for the states. And I looked at when baseball came to that state. At what point in our history did baseball come there? How did it come there? Briefly. I look at those briefly at the beginning of each chapter. So those are sort of the disparate ideas that I decided to throw together and make a book out of. And that's what I'm going to read to you today. Just a couple of things. I refer to firsts, which is always sort of a dangerous thing to do when you're writing baseball history, because as soon as we establish that something was the first time something happened, 2 weeks later, someone discovers it happening sooner. So, it's always a dangerous thing to do, but I talk about firsts. And when I discuss those firsts, I personally think of the National Association as the first major league. I understand that Major League Baseball in 1969 disagreed, but it was my book and I got to make that choice, and so I did. So I'm going to make a reference to a first in Major League Baseball history, but that's a National Association first, just in case you're a purist. Because the chapters are broken up by states, most of what I'm about to read to you guys is Chicago-centric, but because most of the guys who are buried in Illinois are buried near or around Chicago. But I branch out as well. I go to the outer reaches of the state a little bit too. Finally, well, no, I'm going to start reading and then I'll get to that other point when I'm done reading. One moment, let me get the PowerPoint fired up and then I can begin. Birth of the big leagues, Illinois. The first recorded game of baseball played in Chicago by two different teams took place on July 7th, 1858, between the Union Baseball Club and the Plowboys Club of Downers Grove. The Plowboys won that day, and it seems as though Chicagoans have been torn amongst themselves ever since. It is the only city to have had two Major League Baseball franchises every year since 1901. They even had a third, briefly, from 1914 to 1915, when the Whales represented Carl Sandburg's City of Big Shoulders. Unfortunately, their shoulders weren't big enough to sustain the weight of three teams. The Whales, along with the rest of the Federal League, disbanded after 2 seasons, despite Whales owner Charles Wiegman having built a new stadium for his club. Wiegman bought the Cubs the following January and quickly moved the team from their West Side grounds to his eponymous park. The Cubs still call it home today, though by the name of a different magnate, William Wrigley. The Cubs are beloved in Chicago, winning the World Series in 2016 after a 108-year run of failure that makes the Red Sox's 86-year drought seem like a long weekend. Across town, the White Sox had their own string of hopelessness. After 8 players conspired to throw the 1919 World Series, they also had to wait 86 years to atone for their sins in the eyes of the baseball gods. They finally took home the Commissioner's Trophy in 2005, the year after the Red Sox broke their own curse. National League creator William Hulbert worked with Albert Spalding from his home in Chicago to create the framework of the National League in late 1875. It was also in Chicago's Great Northern Hotel where the owners of the minor Western League gathered in 1899 to, among other business, officially change their organization's name to the American League. Like Hulbert, AL President Ban Johnson ran his league from Chicago for many years. When the office of the commissioner was created in 1920, the man chosen to fill the position was another Chicagoan. Thus, the city can rightfully claim that it is the birthplace of the NL, the AL, and the office of the commissioner. Chicago is a baseball town, and it is fitting that 9 Hall of Famers were born there, more than any other city but New York's combined 5 boroughs. As of this writing, 13 are buried there. Luckily, Anna's family is from Chicago. Her mom is a South Side Sox fan, and we visit frequently. There were a lot of graves to go see. Freddie Lindstrom and Gabby Hartnett are both buried in All Saints Cemetery in Des Plaines. Their careers were concurrent in the 1920s and 30s, but they played together for only a single season on the Cubs. Hartnett, born in Rhode Island, spent 19 years behind the plate for the Cubbies and was adopted by the city. Lindstrom only got to play for his native town in 1935 as his career was winding down. Lindstrom's grave bears no evidence of his baseball past. Hartnett's has a modest line engraved below the family name but above the names of himself and his wife, Martha, reading, "Entered Baseball Hall of Fame, 1955. The visit to these 2 graves marks the only time I was accompanied on a hall ball trip by my father-in-law. Bob died not long after I finished the hall ball. I hope he understood how his genealogy bug, which introduced me to the greater purpose and possibilities of cemeteries, inadvertently made this odyssey possible." William Hulbert has a splendid grave marker, a large baseball engraved with the charter cities of the National League on its surface. As mentioned previously, he was denied his rightful place in the hall because of bad luck. It took the Veterans Committee 107 years after he died to rectify the matter. The National Association, predecessor to the National League, sported top-tier talent but was destined for failure because it lacked a visionary of Hulbert's magnitude to create something that had never previously existed. SABR historian David Boehmer refers to him as the father of professional sports leagues, a claim that would be difficult to debate. When one considers the amount of revenue generated by the collective professional sports in America, it could be argued that when it comes to pure dollars and cents, there has been no greater founder than Hulbert. Will Harridge never played baseball and didn't have much interest in the sport as a young man. It was a twist of fate that led to American League President Ben Johnson hiring Harridge as his personal secretary in 1911, the beginning of a 47-year career in the major leagues. His role evolved into secretary for the whole league, a position he kept until 1931, when he became the third president of the American League. As president, he was instrumental in the creation of the All-Star Game, oversaw the relocation of the St. Louis Browns and Philadelphia Athletics, voided the contract of 3'7" Eddie Geidel, and ruled the league with a professionalism and lack of bluster that the owners never experienced under Johnson. Despite having the second highest office in Major League Baseball, Harridge never had a formal written contract during his 28 years as AL president. This photo that you see is the second version taken. The first one, shot on a late cloudy afternoon, was so dark you could barely read Harridge's name. It wasn't until my second visit, when I was hoping to somehow capture a little more sunlight in the secluded corner of the mausoleum at Memorial Park in Skokie, that I discovered that his family's niche had a light switch connected to an overhead fixture. Joining the White Sox in 1912, Ray Schulk was the backstop for the Southsiders for 17 years. Although he never excelled at the plate, he was a reliable defensive team leader. He led the league in games caught 7 times, putouts 9 times, and still holds the career record for double plays turned by a catcher. He also led in caught stealing percentage 3 times, including an incredible 71.8% in 1925. He helped his White Sox defeat the New York Giants in the 1917 World Series and was one of the players who remained clean of the stain of the Black Sox scandal 2 years later. Schulk is credited as one of the first catchers to back up corner infielders, though the practice had been loosely in place for nearly a decade when he joined the White Sox. He has the lowest batting average of any position player in the Hall of Fame, with a lifetime mark of .253. Adrian Constantine Cap Anson and Kennesaw Mountain Landis are not names that your average contemporary baseball fan would immediately think of when tested about the Hall of Fame, but they were both giants in their times. Anson made his debut the same year as the first professional league in 1871 as a member of the Rockford Forest Cities of the National Association. In 1876, the year the National League was created, he joined the circuit's Chicago White Stockings, who, after a few name changes, became the modern-day Cubs. He played the rest of his almost unfathomable 27-year career in Chicago, and upon his retirement owned virtually every record in baseball, including being the first player to record 3,000 hits. All have since been surpassed. Landis was baseball's first commissioner, a man who brought a sense of integrity to one of baseball's darkest hours, the scandal of the 1919 World Series. His hiring was a direct response, and he was effective. He abolished rowdyism and squelched gambling, and his stern authority helped turn the ballpark into a place where one could feel safe to bring a family, a part of the game's modern identity that barely existed at the time. Some say Babe Ruth saved baseball after the Black Sox. Landis deserves perhaps as much credit. The careers of both Landis and Anson were marred by their unfortunate attitudes on race. Landis famously enforced the unwritten color barrier that kept blacks out of Major League Baseball. Branch Rickey had to wait for Landis to die to implement his plan for integration. Anson, for his part, was a participant in the enforcement of the original color line in 1887. His initial refusal on August 10, 1883, to play an exhibition game against the Toledo Blue Stockings because they featured a black catcher named Moses Fleetwood Walker was only one of many voices rising against integrated ball, but his was a powerful voice. Anson's grave marker is made of angles and clean lines. Landis's looks like a miniature representation of his namesake. Both are cared for by the staff at Oak Woods, who are almost exclusively African American. This next round of photos was taken 9 months after the first visit to Chicago, with the exception of Hank O'Day, who wasn't elected until 2013 and necessitated visiting Calvary Cemetery a second time. O'Day, the 10th umpire elected to the Hall, is buried in the same Catholic cemetery as Charles Comiskey, an important name in the history of baseball and a legend in the Windy City. Playing for St. Louis, Cincinnati, and for the lone year of the 1890 Players League, Chicago, Comiskey was a solid, if not outstanding, first baseman. It was his later role as executive and owner that defined his legacy. Comiskey built one of the most successful charter franchises of the American League. His name graced the park the White Sox called home for 90 years before corporate naming rights finally dethroned him in 2003. Sadly, his legacy will be forever connected to the 1919 scandal. His body lies in a family mausoleum, the design of which is very, very befitting of a man nicknamed the Old Roman. Another owner lies buried about an hour south of Comiskey in the misleadingly named city of Blue Island. Andrew Rube Foster is a name that should be as well known as Comiskey's in Chicago and beyond. Like Comiskey, Foster began as a player. Unlike his white counterpart, Foster likely could have been elected to the Hall on his statistics alone. He was a brilliant pitcher and a leader. He played for, managed, and owned the Chicago American Giants starting in 1910. In 1920, he founded the Negro National League, the first of its kind in terms of organized scheduling and postseason play. Like so many tales from the Negro Leagues, his ends tragically, this time with madness and an early death. Where this story differs from Saul White, Frank Grant, and Pete Hill is that 3,000 people attended Foster's funeral. His gravesite bears a solid, large monolith that looks eternal and was a perfect choice for this giant of a man. Pete Hill, meanwhile, is another matter entirely. Amongst his many travels, Hill starred for White's Philadelphia Giants in 1904 to 1907, as well as Foster's American Giants from 1911 to 1918. He left a legacy of speed and power. When the Hall Ball began in 2010, Stu Thornley and the Hall of Fame believed that Pete Hill was the lone member for whom we did not know a burial location. Unbeknownst to me, researcher Jeremy Kroc was hard at work trying to solve this mystery. Kroc is the founder of a group called the Negro Leagues Baseball Grave Marker Project, which itself is a subset of the Negro Leagues Committee of SABR. The name of the project is self-explanatory, and as of this writing, they have installed stones at 30 previously unmarked grave sites. Jeremy himself, an anesthesiologist, is one of the warmest, most unassuming people you could meet. Jeremy ultimately learned that Hill had been buried at Holy Sepulchre Catholic Cemetery in the Chicago suburb of Alsip, despite dying in Buffalo, New York in 1951. Hill's son, Kenneth, had lived in Chicago at the time and had his father's body shipped out to be buried by his church. Once again, there was no stone. I asked Jeremy if the project was going to install something, and he told me that he wasn't certain, as the surviving family had voiced an interest in handling it themselves. The photo of the patch of grass under which Hill lies was officially number 100 in the project. As someone who appreciates numbers, as all baseball fans must to a certain extent, there was a tragic symbolism to this. Numbers 1, Saul White, and 100 belonged to two Negro League greats, teammates in fact, for whom time and circumstance had robbed them of their due. While there was little that could be done about the lost decades, thanks to Jeremy, the circumstances were about to change. One of the most successful player managers of all time, Lou Boudreau, made his major league debut with the Cleveland Indians. He played one game in 1938 and by 1940 was the regular shortstop. In 1942, at the tender age of 24, with only 2 years of full-time play under his belt, Boudreau became the manager of the tribe. The team would struggle through the early years of his tenure. When baseball broke the color barrier in 1947, forward-thinking Indians owner Bill Veeck hired Larry Doby and the following season, Satchel Paige, who both helped to change the Indians' fortunes. Boudreau himself had an unparalleled season in 1948, winning the MVP award and steering his newly stocked club to the championship, making him the only player-manager in baseball history to accomplish the dual feats. After his playing and managing days were over, Boudreau had a 30-year career calling games for the Chicago Cubs from the broadcast booth. Spending his entire 20-year career with the Chicago White Sox, Urban Red Faber won 24 games in 1915, just his second season. He went on to win 20 plus 3 more times and led the league in twice led the league in ERA. He was brilliant during the Sox's successful 1917 World Series, winning 3 games and holding the New York Giants to a .213 batting average. The greater portion of his career was marred by injury, and although he played for another 10 years, he never had a sub-3 ERA after 1923. He still ranks second on the all-time list for wins by a White Sox pitcher, trailing only Ted Lyons. Faber was a founder of Baseball Anonymous, a charitable organization that focused on helping old ball players who were sick or had fallen on hard times. Warren Giles made his first foray into baseball in 1920, when he unexpectedly became the team president of his local club, the Moline Plowboys of the 3I League, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. A community leader, he was invited to attend a meeting about saving the financially strapped baseball team. By the end of the discussion, he had been placed in charge. Rising quickly through the ranks, by the mid-1920s, he was part of Branch Rickey's Cardinals farm system. 10 years later, he was the president of the Cincinnati Reds, whom he led to a world championship in 1940. Giles was one of the finalists, along with eventual winner Ford Frick, for the vacant commissioner's seat when Happy Chandler was removed in 1951. Instead, Giles became president of the National League, a post he held until 1969. During his tenure, he oversaw the moves west of both the Dodgers and Giants, as well as the first wave of expansion. His progressive views about Black and Latino players aided the National League in superseding the junior circuit. His stance is best summarized by a quote from his New York Times obituary. "We are a game of tradition. The right kind of tradition has made baseball what it is, but blindly following tradition may lead into a rut. Baseball must always keep pace with the times." By keeping pace with the times, the National League went 16-5-1 in All-Star games under his leadership. The very first hit in Major League history came on May 4th, 1871, when the Cleveland Forest Cities faced the Fort Wayne Kikiongas of the newly established National Association. That seminal hit, a double, came off the bat of Cleveland catcher Deacon White. White was erased from the base paths when he made the blunder of straying too far off the base after teammate Gene Kimball's pop fly was caught by second baseman Tom Carey, also resulting in Major League Baseball's first double play. This ignominious beginning gave no indication of the legendary career to follow. White was one of the premier hitters of his day, leading the league in batting average twice and RBIs 3 times. He played for an impressive 20 years. It was no small feat for a man who spent the first 9 years of that primarily as a catcher, in an age when protective equipment for the hazardous position was virtually non-existent. When he joined the Buffalo Bisons in 1881, the 33-year-old White shifted to the infield, where he played for another 10 seasons. In 2010, he was chosen as the second recipient of the SABR Overlooked 19th Century Baseball Legends Award. 3 years later, he was elected to the Hall of Fame, 123 years after his final game. What Charles Old Hoss Radbourne accomplished in his brief 11-year career is impressive, but what he did in 1884 is unparalleled. The durable hurler had already thrown over 1,400 innings in his first 3 seasons with the Providence Grays, including 632 1/3 in 1883. In his signature year, He pitched 678 2/3 innings, winning 59 games, completing all 73 of his starts, and finishing 2 others, just for good measure. All of that was wrapped around mid-season drama that saw him miss a number of games due to arm troubles and contract haggling. Fascinatingly, while Radbourne's 59 wins are a record that will never be broken, his single-season inning total is 4 outs behind that statistic's standard-bearer, Will White, who accomplished his feat in 1879. The visit to Radbourne's grave was one of the more memorable in the project. I was stalling in the cemetery office, waiting for Jeremy Kroc to join me. I had become friends with Jeremy, and Bloomington was the closest Hall of Fame grave to his hometown of Peoria. We had agreed to meet there and have lunch. While waiting, I struck up a conversation with the cemetery administrative assistant, Gay Nichols, who asked about the project. When I explained to her that part of the genesis for the whole thing came in part from the unexpected discovery of Abner Doubleday's grandfather, she interrupted me to say, "Oh yes, his father's here." I was flabbergasted. She had to be mistaken. It just couldn't be possible. The National Geological Survey claims there are 109,000 cemeteries in the United States. For me to accidentally stumble upon Doubleday's grandfather was unusual, although somewhat explainable by location. For me to then, 4 years later, also trip over his father's grave 782 miles away borders on the divine. She wasn't confused. She showed me the booklet the cemetery had put together highlighting some of the more famous interments, which included Adlai Stevenson and Dorothy Gage, the 5-month-old infant who inspired the name of L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz heroine. Gay knew exactly what she was talking about. Sadly, however, she did not have an exact location of the grave, just a general area. Ulysses Doubleday, 1792 to 1866, was a successful printer, apprenticing in Cooperstown before becoming an editor in Ballston Spa and Auburn, New York. In 1831, he became a member of the United States House of Representatives, an office he held until 1833, and then again from 1835 to 1837. By 1837, he had lost his fortune when the stock market crashed. After that, Doubleday spent time as a merchant and farmer, but never recovered his wealth. Upon retirement, he moved to Bloomington, and when he died, he was either buried without a marker or with one so modest that it has since been swallowed up by the earth. So that's the Illinois chapter. However, I have some bonus tracks for you guys, or a post-credit scene if you're an MCU fan. There were a number of members of the Hall of Fame who, when they died, they were not buried in the traditional manner. Instead, they were cremated and their ashes were spread about or kept by the family members. And at the very beginning of the project, I had this idea to maybe reach out to the family members and see if they were still in possession of the ashes, if maybe they would let me come to their homes and take a picture of the ball with the ashes. But I decided that that was a bridge too far and was maybe asking a little bit more than was decent. So instead, I came up with what I call the symbolic ones, which were a series of photographs which were taken at a location that was meaningful to those players at some point in their lives. And there were quite a few of these symbolic ones that were either in Illinois or actually very Chicago specific. So I'm gonna jump to that chapter in the book and just read you a little bit on them as well. Mickey Cochran was a catcher for the Philadelphia Athletics and Detroit Tigers from 1925 to 1937. His lifetime .320 batting average is the highest of any backstop in the history of the game. And in 1931, he inspired 19-year-old Mutt Mantle to name his son after him. Bill Veeck was likely the most imaginative individual ever to run a baseball team. Some of baseball's most indelible moments and icons we owe to him. He hired 3'7" Eddie Geidel to pitch in 1951. You're getting 2 Eddie Geidel references today. He created the exploding scoreboard. He hired 42-year-old Satchel Paige to make his major league debut, as well as 54-year-old Minnie Minoso, so that the Cuban legend could become the first player to appear in a game in 5 different decades. He approved the disastrous disco demolition night in 1979, and he planted the ivy that today defines the outfield wall of Wrigley way back in 1937. He did much of this while standing atop a prosthetic leg in which he had installed an ashtray. There will never be another like Vec, and baseball is the poorer for it. Both Cochran and Vec had their ashes spread in Lake Michigan. Though popular wisdom claims that Vec's remains were interred at nearby Oak Woods, the cemetery has no record of his burial, and Stu Thornley has confirmed the reality with Vec's son, Mike. The younger Vec is a successful team owner himself, holding a stake in 5 different independent league teams, including the St. Paul Saints, which he co-owns with actor Bill Murray. Robin Roberts was a workhorse for the Philadelphia Phillies, topping the league in innings pitched 5 times and throwing more than 250 innings 10 times. While the bulk of his success came in the early and mid-1950s, he pitched for 19 years and won 286 ball games with the Phillies, as well as the Baltimore Orioles, the Houston Astros, and the Chicago Cubs before retiring in 1966. He was one of the leading figures in bringing Marvin Miller in as the head of the Players Association, and after retirement, he became a coach at the University of South Florida in Tampa. His original photo for the project was taken at Christ Our Redeemer Church in Temple Terrace, Florida, where Roberts' funeral took place in 2010. However, while pursuing the symbolic photo of Al Barlick, I unexpectedly drove past Robin Roberts Field in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. I considered it a much more fitting tribute, and the resulting photo is the one you see here. The romantic image of the hidden gem rising from the coal mines of Middle America to become a ball player in the major leagues is a truism when it comes to Al Barlick, except that he made his name as an umpire, not a player. He had a 28-year career in the majors and called some of the most memorable games in history, including serving as the first base arbiter on April 15, 1947, when Jackie Robinson played his first game in Brooklyn. He was behind the plate for 6 no-hitters and served on the crew of 7 World Series. The first game he ever called, however, was as a member of the company team for the Peabody No. 59 coal mine, where he worked alongside his father. The ball is photographed at the last remaining physical structure from the mine, a shaft which is located 1/10 of a mile off Old Route 36 in Springfield. While we were passing through Springfield, we decided to make one other stop. There's not a lot of pictures of the Hall Ball with a person who is not a Hall of Famer, but I decided to make an exception for Abe Lincoln, especially because that old illustration from just before, during the presidential race is that you see off to the left is one of my favorites from baseball history. So that's Honest Abe. It may have taken the Cubs 108 years to win a championship, but they far surpass their Southside rivals when it comes to beloved former players. Perhaps no player ever returned that love with such enthusiasm, creating quite as passionate a marriage, as Ron Santo. Making a big enough impression during his freshman year of 1960 to finish 4th in Rookie of the Year voting, Santo manned the hot corner of Wrigley Field for 14 years before spending one final year with the White Sox in 1974. Santo hit 20 or more home runs 11 times in his career. While his batting average broke 300 only 4 times, he was also a 4-time league leader in drawing bases on balls, allowing him to also pace the circuit in on-base percentage in 1964 and 1966. Almost 15 years after Santo played his final game, he started providing color commentary for Chicago Cubs radio broadcasts on WGN, further cementing his legacy with the club. He spent the next 20 years in the booth waiting for the call from Cooperstown that never came. The announcement of his election happened on December 5th, 2011, 1 year and 2 days after he succumbed to complications from bladder cancer and diabetes. In August of that year, on a day which featured the unveiling of a statue of Santo in front of Wrigley Field, the family held a private ceremony in which Santo's ashes were spread around third base in the iconic park. The photo was taken from the track running along the third baseline, the closest a civilian could get to the sacred green of baseball's second oldest stadium. And then I just have one other. I had discussed in the chapter on Illinois the story of Pete Hill and how he was buried in an unmarked grave. Well, Jeremy Kroc and the family did in fact follow up on that. And if you go to the cemetery now, you can see a grave for Pete Hill. I went back and got a picture with the ball a few years later. At the present time, I do not believe, with the possible exception of the very complicated tale of Cristobal Torriente, that any Hall of Famers are currently in an unmarked grave, although honestly, Stu's here and he may be able to correct me if I'm wrong. And there you go. Oh, I have one other update too. I had mentioned in the book that as of this writing, there were 13 Hall of Famers buried in Chicago. There now are officially 14. Ernie Banks passed while I was, since I finished writing the book. I was lucky enough to get a photo of Ernie with the ball while he was still alive. So if you read the book, you'll be able to see Ernie still alive and vibrant. My visit with Ernie was one of my favorites with a living player in the whole project. Most of my interactions with the living guys lasted about 30 seconds, if that. You know, I gave them the elevator pitch that I had refined over the years, and most of them just took the ball and smiled, and that was the end of it. Ernie actively kept me in the room, had me stay and chatted with me about baseball and my bizarre passion for a good 5-10 minutes, which was great because it was Ernie Banks. Like, you know, all Hall of Famers are of a rare breed, but, you know, there are some that are above and beyond, and Ernie was one of those. So I was super appreciative that I was able to spend some time with him before he passed.
That was fantastic, Ralph. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Just looking at Illinois alone, you're talking now about 15 plus different sites.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a small subset of the entire project. When you first sat down to do this, did you just go, I'm going to do this? Or how did that happen? How'd you plan this out?
Well, I was lucky in that, and I say this in the book, I was lucky in that I live in New York City. So there are a large number of them buried in New York City. If you take the 5 boroughs and Westchester and the Metro Jersey area, there's at least 20, or there's more than 20 buried there. So I was able to get this really great head start and not really have to go very far. And I started, you know, at the beginning, I wasn't confident I was going to follow through on this. You know, some of these guys were buried in rather far-flung places. Alexander Cartwright was buried in Hawaii, which, you know, to me might as well have been Mars. And, you know, there were 3 guys who were buried in Cuba, which when I first began this project, you know, it was extraordinarily difficult for an American to even set foot there. So I wasn't sure at first if I was even really going to complete it. I decided to just get started and see where it went. And I would say that probably by the time I took that Pete Hill photo, by the time I got through the first 100 guys, I knew I was in this for the long haul. And that's when I started to make specific plans about specific trips. I tried to, you know, I sat down with the map and tried to lay it out. You know, I tried to, there was a lot of logistics involved in pulling it off, you know, just in terms of being able to make the drives in a reasonable amount of time, to try and get there before cemeteries closed. That was, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that for some of these cemeteries, they're just sort of open fields and you come and go as you please. But some of them, you know, had actual offices with fences around them that closed at dusk and you couldn't get in after sunset. And, you know, I was trying to minimize how much breaking and entering I had to do. There were a couple of moments that probably were technically not legal over the course of the project, but, you know, I tried to minimize those. So, you know, it was about trying to get to the cemeteries even before sunset. You know, so that also depended heavily on when I was doing my travel. I work at a college, which meant that I had, you know, a nice break in December and January, and then I had my summers to do a lot of travel. So, you know, but even in those December and January visits, you know, the sun sets so early that I had a smaller window to be able to get the photos in. I didn't want to take any of the photos using a flash. You know, the photos aren't a brilliant to begin with. Like if you're an actual photographer, I apologize to you in advance if you read the book, because the photos were taken with my iPhone. I'm not a professional photographer. I knew that I was not going to have the quickness that would have been necessary to take the photos of the living guys with real photography equipment. So I just decided that I was going to use the iPhone throughout the whole project, and all of the photos except for a couple. There were two photos that were taken not by me. They were taken by someone else because I wasn't going to be able to get to those guys. And it became more important to me that the ball interacted with the Hall of Famers than I myself interacted with the Hall of Famers. That was the point of the project, was the ball and not me. So there are a couple of photos in the book that were taken by someone else that weren't taken on an iPhone. But other than that, of the 340 photos in the book, 338 of them were taken with my iPhone, which, isn't really great at certain elements of perspective and dealing with light limitations. So there was a lot of logistics that had to be figured out along the journey to make sure I got to places in time to get the pictures. And that became part of the fun of the project for me, because it really was, scheduling this incredible travel that I got to do in these disparate parts of the country that I probably definitely would never have seen if it weren't for trying to complete this project. So.
Ralph, you talk about having to break into a cemetery. Or do things a little. I've done that a couple times. I don't think with the Hall of Famers, but you and I would have both been at one that probably was illegal, at least in technical sense. To me, more it was scary because I usually pay attention to no trespassing signs in Texas, of all places. But
right.
Rogers Hornsby, at least I had heard a lot of people went through that gate and went down that road and got him. But did you have some of the same trepidation?
Yeah, most definitely. I had the warning of Stu's website. Stu had said, I think you say on your website, there's a no trespassing sign on it. So I knew to look for that when I got there. And it was for sure a closed fence with a no trespassing sign on it. And there was a house right there that the yard of the house was filled with shit. Like, it was just so much crap, like cars on blocks. And it was one of those situations. And they had a giant Doberman that just came running right to the edge of the fence, barking as loud as he could. And I had someone with me that day, and I was like, I don't know if we should do this. This seems like a really dangerous, bad idea. And she was like, no, do it. Go ahead, do it. So I got out of the car and I opened up, the fence opened, like it wasn't locked in any way. And we drove down that road, and Stu's been on it. It's very small, and all the trees are sort of overgrown around it. And my rental car was getting the shit scratched out of it as I drove down it, as all of the branches were like clawing. And it's not short either. It's like a good 3/4 of a mile, that road. And, I'm driving down it super slow, and I wasn't sure if I really should be doing this, but you get to the end, and there is the Hornsby Bend Cemetery. And then there's another cemetery right next to it, which I tell the story about this in the book, which is fascinating to me. It's connected to a cemetery that was reserved for the Mexican immigrants who lived in the Hornsby Bend area. The land actually belongs to Rogers Hornsby's family, and they donated the land to the church specifically for the use of the Mexican migrants who were in that area at the turn of the 20th century. Which was fascinating to me because, Hornsby's story is always connected to racism and him being on the rolls of the KKK, and to know that his family dedicated this portion of not just any land, like that's their family cemetery there, essentially, that they donated this portion of land to the Mexican immigrants, just sort of gave me this fascinating insight to a larger picture of who Rogers Hornsby was and where he came from.
During the trip, did you also make sure you're visiting the graves at the places you might have gone or close to where you were gone? Famous musicians, famous actors, maybe other ball players
sometimes
that sometime be in the hall?
Yeah, sometimes I at the beginning of the project, no. At the beginning of the project, because like I said, it was all I was sort of figuring it out as I went along, and I was very single-minded and very focused, no. But as things went along, yes, I tried to make sure that if there was a chance to visit other people, I did. Like, when I was in LA, You know, the cemeteries where guys like Casey Stengel and Hank Greenberg are buried are littered with, you know, Hollywood icons from throughout history. So I made a point by that point, you know, by the time I got to California, I was well into the project, and the planning was more specific. I definitely took time to go and visit people outside of the world of baseball, and try to expand. I also tried to, before I went on any of the trips, to do my research about the player and about, you know, about the place where I was going, just to have a little understanding. And not a lot of it made its way into the book because, you know, again, I didn't want it to be 1,000 pages long, but it was enlightening for me to sort of have this background knowledge before I went to any of these places about, you know, what they were doing there, how they got there. Rube Foster's half brother, Bill Foster, is buried in this out of the way section of Alabama, and I had no idea what he was doing there, and then researching how he got there and everything was fascinating for me, because he actually was teaching at a college that was in that area. And it's his grave is fascinating because he was ultimately elected to the Hall of Fame of that college, and that is cited on his grave, but it doesn't mention the fact that he was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame.
So as far as your trip is concerned, you started doing the Hall Ball project. It morphed at some point into a book or a book idea. And you mentioned in your book, I think you even mentioned a little bit earlier, that the kind of book that you ended up writing was vastly different than how you started. What were you planning originally, and how did it change?
I mean, I originally was just doing biographies of all of the players, but I don't know, I was probably 4 or 5 chapters in before I was boring myself doing that. Like, you know, it felt like I was simply regurgitating the SABR bio project, which, you know, there was no reason to put that in a book that had already been done. So I was trying to find different angles. And, you know, over the course of this, what I like to say to people is that when I began this project in 2010, I was a baseball fan who had some sense of an understanding of baseball history. I, you know, read a fair number of baseball history books. But the project sort of became like my, you know, my master's work, you know, for college, because in visiting these 318 individuals, I did my research and learned a lot about baseball history, to a point where, I mean, I guess now, because I got, you know, my first royalties check, I can legitimately call myself a baseball historian. And quite frankly, it's got me trying to shift careers. I've been working in professional theater for 25 years, and it's been a great ride, but my joy these days comes from baseball research and not from making theater. Theater to me feels like a bit of a drag right now. So I'm trying to shift over to becoming a professional baseball historian after a career in professional theater, because clearly I have no interest in making money whatsoever. I just want to pursue jobs that guarantee poverty.
So for the folks that may be watching or may watch later that are aspiring authors, how did you find the process work with McFarland in terms of pitching the book to them, editing the book? How did that go?
It went quickly and smoothly in terms of pitching the book. Like, I had sent it out to about 10 different publishers, and within the month, I would say 5 or 6 of them said that they weren't interested, and I didn't hear from any of the others. And then McFarland wrote me within that first month. McFarland wrote me, and McFarland had been a long shot to me when I submitted it, because if you go to the author submission section of their website, they make it very clear that they really only want 1 or 2 photographs per chapter. McFarland is not big on spending the money that it costs to publish a bunch of photos, and this book has 350 photographs in it. So I thought McFarland was a bit of a long shot. But they wanted it. They wanted to publish it. So it was, you know, compared to some authors' stories, I got relatively lucky. You know, I didn't spend years trying to sell the book. I sold it in about a month. I don't know how many, you know, I see a number of faces here, folks who I know have probably published with McFarland. McFarland is wonderfully supportive in terms of publishing baseball history. But because they are small, they don't have like an advertising budget for you or anything like that. You know, when you publish with McFarland, you're doing the work pretty much all on your own. They'll print you up some flyers and some bookmarks, and then it's up to you to take it from there. And it's been a particularly difficult year to publish with a small publisher like McFarland, because most of the traditional stuff that an author will do to sell their books, you know, involving readings and public appearances and stuff like that, I couldn't do this year. The book came out in June. You know, I had this elaborate plan, this whole fantasy. You know, to get a lot of these pictures of the living guys, I've been going to induction weekend for the last 10 years. And if you've ever been to induction weekend or even just Cooperstown, there's a bookshop on Main Street there, Modi's Used Books. And if you're there on induction weekend, there's always an author set up out front selling their book. And I had this, you know, this fantasy of that being me. I'm that guy this year, you know, 2020, I'm going to be the guy sitting at that table selling my book. And Derek Jeter was getting inducted. So, you know, town was just going to be littered with people because it was New York. Like I was going to have this huge potential market to sell to. I was up in Cooperstown in February. It was actually the last thing that I did before the pandemic. The last bit of travel and fun that I did was I was up in Cooperstown, and I met with Modi, the guy who owns the bookshop, and gave him my card. And he said, get back to me in a month and we'll figure out which dates are going to be yours. Like, you know, it was all there. And then the plague hit. And so I had, you know, 80 copies of the book that I bought sitting in these boxes in my house that I thought I was going to sell at these readings, and not so much. So, you know, I'm never going to say a bad word about McFarland, because they really were wonderful in terms of giving a first-time author, you know, a seamless and supported chance to get my stuff out there. But I'm hoping for the next book that I can maybe find a publisher who's got a little money to spend on helping me sell it.
In the ball itself, I'm picturing Phil Pritchard, white gloves. It's got the Stanley Cup in this giant case. And it's taken from place to place under armed guard. How did you travel around with the baseball?
It was in a Ziploc bag. I put it in a Ziploc. I didn't put it in anything at first. I was just carrying it around. And I wrote at the very beginning, I took the ball, and I didn't mention this at the beginning, but it was a ball that we found on that same trip where we went to the cemetery and found Abner Doubleday's grave. We found the ball in Willow Creek, which is that little creek that runs next to Doubleday Field in Cooperstown. It had been a foul ball from, you know, probably some high school game or something that had taken place there. And when I decided that was the ball I was going to use for the project, I took a Sharpie and I just wrote the Hall ball on it so that it was clear in each photograph that it was the same baseball. I wanted to establish for the viewer that they were looking at the same baseball. And it was, you know, a couple of years in that I started to notice that the Sharpie was wearing off a little bit from all of the handling that I had done with it. So from that point, I started keeping it in a plastic bag when I traveled. And then when I got home, I put it in one of the little plexi cubes to keep it safe from the sunlight. But no, there was no armed guard or serious security. And there were a couple of terrifying moments over the course of the project where I thought I had lost it. There was once in Cuba, when I went to Cuba, I had to fly from Havana to Holguin, which, you know, it had an in-country flight. And they have a rule in Cuba when you're flying, one of the things that you're not allowed to bring with you on a plane is sporting equipment. And the baseball counted as sporting equipment. So I wasn't allowed to keep it on my person for the flight. I had to put it in my check bag, which was the first time I had done that. It had never been in checked luggage on any flight. I always kept it close by. So that was a terrifying 2+ hour flight. Bill Nolan was there. He probably remembers my angst. I also had a time when, so one of the other graves in the project, one of the ones that started out unmarked, and I mentioned him, was the very first one that I took a photo of, which was Saul White, which was near where I lived in Staten Island. I was living in Staten Island at the time, and Saul was buried not far from that. And his grave was unmarked. And a couple of years in, I worked with Jeremy, and we managed to get a stone placed at Saul's grave. And there was a ceremony that day, and John Thorne was there, and there was a local Little League that was there, and there were elected officials there, and it was this big to-do, and it was all fun and wonderful. And my parents drove down. My parents live up in Albany, and they drove down to come be a part of the ceremony. And I had the ball on me. I brought it with me. There was someone who was coming to the event who was a fan of the Hall ball and wanted to see it. So I brought the ball with me so he could see it. And then later that night, after the ceremony, my father and I went to a Mets game. And I still had the ball on me, and I left it in the car. And we went into the game, and then we came out of the game, whatever it was, 3 hours later, and I went looking for the car, and I couldn't find it. The car was gone. And I started panicking. I was like, oh my God, the car is gone. And my father was like, don't worry about it. You're insured. You'll get a new car. I'm like, I don't care about the car. So we wandered around the parking lot, and eventually I went over to a cop, and I was like, I think my car has been stolen. He said, your car hasn't been stolen. I was like, no, I swear it was right here, and it's not. He's like, nope, it hasn't been stolen. I'm like, well, then where is it? He's like, there's another parking lot right next to this parking lot that looks just like this one. It's in that one, I promise you. And I went over, and it was in fact in that parking lot. He was totally right. I must have been like the 1,000th person who's done that in his tenure as a police officer who has to guard the parking at Citi Field. But there were a couple of moments where I thought I had lost it. I brought it with me once to one of the baseball card shows, and I had taken it out. Like, this was very early on, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it. This was another part that I didn't mention to everybody. What I decided that the goal for the ball was going to be when I was done with it was that I was going to donate it to the Hall of Fame. But I was curious before I made that donation as to how much it might be worth. You know, it's got to be worth something, right? Baseball people buy anything. So I brought it with me to the show, and I brought it to a couple of the dealers' tables to get, you know, their guess as to how much it might be worth. And then I was wandering around and doing a little shopping because, you know, if you're at a baseball card show, you got to do a little shopping. And then I realized that I had no idea where the ball was. And I thought that maybe I had set it down when I was at one of those tables. So I started panic running up and down all of the rows and looking for it, and it actually was just in my jacket pocket the whole time. So I had some close calls that in the end weren't actually all that close, but I panicked. But there was no serious security at all.
You get to the point where you had it with you at all times on the off chance you might run into Mike Piazza somewhere?
I definitely brought it to events where I thought there might have been a chance, even if I didn't have anything lined up. I didn't bring it. It didn't travel with me on a normal day-to-day basis. That felt too fraught and too easy for it to be lost. Normally it just stayed home. But if I went somewhere, you know, if I went any trip I went to Cooperstown, I certainly brought it with me, even if there weren't supposed to be any Hall of Famers in town. It always came with me on one of those trips because we got to, you know, I'm close enough that we make it to Cooperstown at least 3 or 4 times a year, at least in normal years. So, you know, even when it wasn't an induction weekend, I brought the ball with me on the chance that someone might be there. That never panned out. I never bumped into a Hall of Famer and got the picture that way. Every Hall of Famer picture was most definitely the product of planning and scheduling.
So one of the most fascinating parts of the book for me were the recounting of your 2 trips to Cuba. Is that, I guess in my estimation, that seems like it might be a book in itself. Is that something you may have been thinking about?
I mean, there's definitely a book I want to write about Cuba, but it actually has, it's specifically about Martin Dihigo. You know, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, because there's definitely people here who would know, but I don't think there has been an English treatment of Martin Dihigo's career at any point. His son, Gilberto, wrote a biography about Dihigo at one point, but it's in Spanish. So I don't know if there is a book. So I definitely want to write one about Dihigo. I don't know if there's one I would write about Toriente, and that's the reason I had to make that second trip to Cuba. I went down the first time and took my photographs, and then while I was there, was informed that Toriente wasn't actually buried in Cuba. He was buried somewhere else. So I came back home and did some research and realized that it looked like Toriente was buried in Queens, which was super convenient for me. So I went to that cemetery and got a photograph there. And then I received an email from a Cuban documentary filmmaker who said, no, he really is down here. I found the bones. Come here and I'll show you. So I went back to Cuba a second time to connect with that guy and to look at what he had found. And there is definitely a story to be told in Cristobal Toriente's life and unfortunate death and the uncertainty of where he's buried. And I'll say that at this point, I don't know where he's buried. There is compelling evidence, both from the lack of documentation at the cemetery in Queens and in the forensic research that the Cuban folks have done, that it could go either way. But I am uncertain as to where he's actually buried. I just include pictures of both locations in the book. So I figure I have my bases covered.
Looks like we have a question from Dixie Boston.
This question is for both Ralph and Stu. One of the players most important to me is Archie Vaughan. And I know that he's buried probably in one of the most remotest places you can try and get to for his gravesite. I was wondering if both Ralph and Stu had a story about getting to Eagleville, California.
I mean, I can say that people ask me which location is the one that I want to go back to the most. And I know it sounds crazy when you have places like Hawaii and Cuba in the list. But the one that a misanthrope like me is desperate to go back to is Eagleville, California. It's about 6 hours north of San Francisco and about 6 hours south of Boise, which is, I give those coordinates because that was my trip, was I went from San Francisco up to the northeast corner of California where Archie Vaughan is, and then I went up to Idaho to get the picture of Harmon Killebrew. It is, in fact, the most remote of all the places that I went. Even Cruces, Cuba, where Dihigo is buried, that's only at like 3 hours from Havana. Like, that's remote, but it's only about 3 hours from Havana. Eagleville, California is the most remote place I possibly have ever been on this earth. The town, I believe, if you look the town up on Wikipedia, I believe their town population is somewhere around 27. They are, it is just open, wide expanses of land, beautiful mountainscape, and everywhere you go, everything smells like fresh, wild sage. It was just one of the most beautiful and quiet and peaceful places I have ever been. Stu,
I'd like to go. Yeah, I'd like to go back there too, but I probably never will. I got there in 2001, and this was after the Cuba trip, in which we got to what was then just Digo in the Hall of Fame, and I had about 40 to go, and I said, okay, I'm gonna do them, and I had a plan for getting to places, but looking at going to San Francisco to get up to Eagleville, looked like it might be easier to go to Southern Oregon. As it turns out, for work, and I was on something called the Drinking Water Academy, and they had a meeting starting on a Monday, Tuesday in Reno. And I had already said to my boss, I don't really think I need to go this year, because on Wednesday night I was leaving for Boston, where I was going to see Bill Nowlin. We went to a Red Sox game. Paul Wendt took me around to Boston graves. Just seemed to be too much. But then when I discovered that, Reno was a really good jumping off point to get up to Eagleville, I went back to my boss and, I really should be there. I'm going to do it. So, and I not only got that, I did go down to San Francisco. It's the only two times I've been to the games at the Giants' new stadium. And I think I had to get to Joe DiMaggio anyway, because he had died since I had last been there, which I think might have been the SABR convention, stuff like that. So, yeah, it was nice. Got into Reno and just headed up a road through the desert, mostly on the Nevada side, and then crossed in. And I don't think I knew exactly where it was. You know, Eagleville, fine, but cemetery or anything like that, we always try to find, you know, get some certainty on where we're going before we leave. And I don't remember if I stopped at a post office or something. There wasn't too much in that town, which was what made it fun. And but I guess from somebody outside a general store, I was told where it was and went there and found it. So it, you know, it's great when you, like Dixie, you got your favorite players that you want to go see, but the stories behind getting to these places, I kind of wrote it up in a journal one time too, just on some of the goofiness or some of the different things, or how do you find it? I've probably BS'd family members about my intentions to get some of those things. And sometimes I've just gotten to a cemetery without knowing where it is and taken the chance. Bowie Kuhn, I could find out his cemetery, but not the location. Got lucky, went there and you know, within 10 minutes was able to find it.
Yeah, sometimes there was a lot of luck involved. When I took the picture of Stan Musial, you know, like I said, I used Stu's website as a reference point. But when Stu got his photo, Musial was still buried inside in the mausoleum. So we got to the mausoleum and I was looking around and I found the exact spot. I could tell by the tiles on the floor that I was in the exact spot where Stu had taken his picture. But Musial wasn't there. I had no idea where he possibly could have been. So we were, you know, and it was a Saturday, the office was closed. Like I couldn't even ask the people in the office. So we were just going to leave. And I was going to maybe try and come back on Monday, although I think there was something going on that I wasn't even going to be in St. Louis again. And we were starting to drive away and my wife was like, let's just, you know, and it's not a small cemetery. He's in Belle Reeve's, or no, he's not in Belle Reve. Which one is he in against too? Doesn't matter. It's a bigger cemetery. And we were just starting to pull away and my wife was like, why don't you just drive down this road and let's see. And I was like, all right. So I drove down the road and within seconds, there was Stan Musial. Like she was you know, I always make a point of giving my wife credit for this because, you know, she's the one who found Doubleday's grave. She's the one who went and got the ball out of the creek. And, you know, she's the one who tolerated our family vacations being visiting dead ball players for 8 years. And she like magically found Stan Musial's grave that day. Sometimes there really was just luck involved in finding the right place.
Looks like Jeff Cohen has a question. You can go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, and great presentation, Ralph. Always great to hear you speak. Recently, I went to see the grave site of Babe Ruth, and I went into the office to find out where it is. Mm-hmm. And they told me at least once a day, someone comes in looking for his grave site. My question to you is, has any office given you problems or trouble going to see one of the grave sites?
No, normally the offices are super helpful in pointing it out. A lot of the offices, you know, for some of these cemeteries, that Hall of Famer that's buried there, not necessarily where Ruth is buried, because there's quite a few famous people in Gates of Heaven. But you know, for a lot of these cemeteries, that Hall of Famer is like one of the most famous people they have buried there, and there's a certain pride in that. Most of them are super helpful. The only one, you know, Stu was talking just a second ago how you had to, you know, sort of maybe fudge a little bit what you said. The only one that was a little problematic was Don Drysdale was cremated, and his ashes after his cremation were stored in a crypt at the same cemetery where I think Casey Stengel is buried yes. For a long time. And then eventually the family came and got them and took them away. So I was trying to find the crypt that Stu had already taken the picture of, and they didn't want to tell me where that was at first. And eventually I had to say, I'm, you know, his nephew, and I've never really had a chance. And this is my one chance to say goodbye because I don't live in California, and I had to like create this whole story. And then they eventually took me there to go and find Drysdale's grave. But most of the time, folks were super helpful.
Ralph, I did that in San Diego because you mentioned in your book that you couldn't get them to take
all right, bid fees.
And
right.
I went back and looked at my notes, and I think the guy, when I asked him if they could take it out, he he prompted me. He said, you are family, right? And oh yes, you know,
Yes,
so
yes,
and then he
of course I
took it
am.
out and it's very nice. And Drysdale isn't a private mausoleum. I'd found out from people. Well, W.C. Fields is in there, all of that, and they have that Last Supper show. And what you have to do is go in there and say that you're there for the Last Supper show, and they say, okay, going is to the left, and then you just. And it sounds like I do have a map of where they're buried in Hollywood, which is great. You know, they sell maps to the homes. They also sell them to the graves, and so that's one of the tricks. But Napoleon Lajoie, when I was at the office, they didn't know who he was, and that one just. I mean, they gave me the info. That one kind of bummed me out.
Yeah.
But then the next morning, when I was in Jacksonville and was in there early and caused some suspicion of cemetery guy came over and I said, oh, I'm here to see Bill Terry's grave. Oh, okay. And not only that, as we were walking toward it, he, with great pride, said, I put him in there. And I love that, because but Willie Stargell was a private thing with the cemetery. So I used SABR members, found one in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I said, can you just go over there, look at the cemetery? Is it really big? And then he wrote back and said, or called me and said, I just went in there. I didn't go to the office, found a caretaker on the grounds who probably didn't know he wasn't supposed to say anything, took him right to it. And this guy went back and took Polaroid photographs of landmarks and drew me a complete map. So that's the greatness of SABR for that kind of thing too.
For sure.
I have one follow-up, sorry. I also noticed that Lou Gehrig's grave is very close to the next cemetery over from Babe Ruth. And on his stone, there's like a kind of a lock gate on there. Do you know what's behind there?
Yeah, his ashes. His and Eleanor's ashes are behind that door. Yeah, it's the story of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig's graves are an early one from the project and one of my favorites, just because the two graves sort of perfectly represent who those two people were. Babe Ruth's is gigantic, like double tiered, with this huge relief image of Jesus and a little boy playing, in a baseball uniform, and there's quotes all over it from Cardinal Spellman, who delivered Ruth's eulogy, and it's this massive thing that's littered with mementos. People leave stuff all over it all the time, and then in an adjoining cemetery, Ruth is buried in Gates of Heaven. Right next to it is Kensico. They actually used to be the same cemetery. Kensico used to have all of that, and then at the turn around 1920s, I think. Kensico sold a portion of that land to Gates of Heaven for a separate cemetery. So they're technically separate, but they're conjoined. And Ruth's is, his massive grave is on top of this giant hill that sort of overlooks everything. And then Gehrig's grave over at Kensico is much more modest. It's, it's about 3 feet wide, maybe 2.5 feet tall. And it just has his name and dates, doesn't even mention baseball. And it has these little copper doors on it. And behind those copper doors are his and Eleanor's ashes. They actually, after Gehrig died, his ashes were put in there, and people were trying to break in and take them. And so for a very brief period of time, Eleanor Gehrig was in talks with the Hall of Fame for that to become the repository of his ashes. She was going to move his ashes to the Hall of Fame, but she was keeping the whole thing very, very quiet, and it ended up hitting the news somehow. And as soon as it hit the news, she put the kibosh on the whole thing, and it never, ever happened. But it was briefly discussed that Lou's ashes were going to be moved to Cooperstown, and then it didn't happen.
Thank you.
Jason, it looks like Jason Schwartz has a question.
Okay. Yeah, Ralph, question for you. You talked about walking around the card show, having dealers assess the ball. My question for you today, knowing that this was such a big part of your life for like 8 years plus, if somebody offered you $100,000, would you take it?
Well, I wouldn't, because I made it clear to the living players over the course of the project that I wasn't doing it for money. And I'm the kind of person who I can't go back on that now, as much as I would love $100,000. I would feel like I had lied to them over the course of the project, and that's not who I am. So as tempting as that is, probably not, as much as, you know, I certainly, I thought about it. I can't lie and say I didn't think about it. But it's interesting because when I took it around to those shows and tried to get someone to appraise it, most of them were unwilling. I mean, all of them were unwilling to put a dollar value on it, because so much of the baseball memorabilia world and deciding how much something is worth is based entirely on precedent. And there is no precedent. No one has ever made something like this. There's also no signatures on it. I don't know if I made that clear, but when I was taking the ball around to the living guys, I made it, I did not want to collect autographs. And there were multiple reasons for that. One of them is just pure logistics. You know, I photographed 74 living Hall of Famers. There's no way to fit 74 signatures on a baseball. At best, you can maybe get 30, 35. So I knew that that wasn't going to be a thing, but on a higher, more artistic scale, part of the whole point of the project was to bring together all of the Hall of Famers in a way that haven't been done before, both you know, living and deceased, the more obscure Hall of Famers with the ones who are more well known. And by getting the photographs, that sort of like divided the living from the dead in a way that I didn't really want to do. And, you know, and the money factor was part of it too. I got very few of the photographs of the living guys that I pay for. I probably paid for about 5 of them. Most of them I got for free because I made friends with the guys who run the baseball card shows, you know, the people who put those on. I went to them and explained what the project was, and most of them were super supportive and sort of gave me like this backstage access. When the guys were done on the floor doing, you know, signing things for 2 hours, they would usually come in the back and do a private signing of other merch. And that was when the people who ran the baseball card shows typically got me in there to do that. And because they were sort of giving me this service for free that they normally charge for, you know, I didn't want to add the autographs on top of it, because autographs are a commodity. I mean, that's you know, that's how most of these well, not anymore, but for, you know, a lot of the old timers, that was how they made their living after they retired, right? They went around and they signed baseballs. And I didn't want to take advantage of the generosity that was shown to me by making it a thing that was going to have a monetary value attached to it. I can't lie though and say that I'm not super curious how much some Uber Hall of Fame fan might be willing to pay for it. I'd love to know.
Looks like you had a question, Richard Smiley.
Ooh, yeah, get your mic.
Yeah. This question's for Ralph, but I suppose it would be for Stu too. As you guys were going around to the graves, what was like the biggest surprise? Or did you have a big surprise where you just went in somewhere and then all of a sudden you were like walking out of there going, wow, I didn't know this, or something really just surprised you, and even, you know, when you found the grave?
Well, I will say that the thing that I found surprising over the length of the project was how many of them don't mention baseball on their stone whatsoever. Like, I guess it's one thing if you were a Hall of Famer who died before you were elected into the Hall of Fame. If you were one of those Negro Leaguers, for example, who, you know, if you were lucky enough to have a stone, it had bare minimal information on it. That's one thing, especially because you probably weren't elected into the Hall until after you died. But, you know, there were plenty of them who were in the Hall of Fame before they passed, and there is absolutely no mention of the Hall of Fame or their baseball career whatsoever on their stone. If I was in the Hall of Fame, that would be, you know, it would be, you know, this big Ralph Carhart Hall of Famer. Like, I would not be shy about that. But, you know, there were a lot of guys who don't mention baseball at all. In fact, I kind of noticed that they were the ones who were veterans, like Duke Snider, for example. They will mention their military service on their stone before they mention baseball at all, which was a fascinating sort of look into how they looked at their life when they reached the end, you know, what they valued over what they accomplished. But yeah, that to me was, I guess if we're talking about surprises, one of the bigger surprises is that there were a lot of these where, you know, they don't mention that they were even a ball player, nonetheless one that was good enough to make it to the Hall of Fame.
You know, I can't think of any great surprises for me. And I'm trying to think, Richard, I remember spending time with you and the others in Hot Springs in 2004, if I even hit Hall of Fame graves on the way down. One of the reasons, there's been a predecessor to all of us, Dave D'Antonio, who was a SABR member in the 90s and wrote a travel essay called Invincible Summer. And he'd not tried to get to every grave, but he had just taken off with his car and drove around the country, and was often doing it too without knowing where. I mean, his job was tough. He might get to a place on a Saturday and he couldn't find it, and he have to wait till Monday. So I expected what a lot of the graves are, like that Johnny Mize had practically the baseball encyclopedia on his marker, and things like that. Sometimes just the fun surprises were seeing the offerings. I left one on Babe Ruth's grave the first time I was there, and then it was somebody who told me a few years later, I think it was Fred Ivor Campbell, you know, did you write a note at Babe Ruth's grave? Because it's in the Babe Ruth Museum in Baltimore. And they had apparently picked it up that time, but seeing a fire truck on Rube Waddell's grave, that was cool. If I had any surprise, it was when I shouldn't have been surprised. I think when I finally got to the Babe Ruth Museum and saw that note, I left a few days early to go out to Washington for a conference. And so on Saturday, I was going to Rube Marquardt's grave in Baltimore, and got there, and oh, heck, it's closed. And is it going to be closed for the weekend? And then finally, he's buried in a Jewish cemetery. It was closed on Saturday. I had to make arrangements to come back on Sunday, and I was able to get in there. So some of the surprises were ones that maybe I shouldn't have been surprised about.
One of the fun little side trips that I made that was an interesting insight. When I went from Ty Cobb's grave to, I took a symbolic photo for Tom Yawkey. When Tom Yawkey died, he was cremated and he had his ashes spread over this nature preserve in South Carolina that he used to own. He and Ty Cobb used to go hunting and fishing there, and Ted Williams. And on that drive, making that drive is Greenville, South Carolina. So we stopped and we spent the night there and saw a minor league game of the Greenville Drive. And then we popped over to the cemetery where Shoeless Joe Jackson is buried. And talking about the graves where, people leaving things behind on the graves, Babe Ruth is the one who has the most stuff left on his grave, undoubtedly. But surprising to me, a very, very close second was Shoeless Joe Jackson. His grave was just covered in baseballs and bats and shoes. People were leaving shoes behind. Like his grave was filled with stuff, which was, interesting to me considering the story.
I got to put my own shoes on Jackson's grave, and then I, of course, took them back. My favorite, though, is I did leave a fuchsia brawn panties on the grave of J. Edgar Hoover when I got there one year. They weren't my own. I purchased them at Target.
You got them from someone else.
Well, Ralph, this has been phenomenal. Thanks for spending the time with us today. I think maybe the last question I would have is, as I read the book, it's interesting to see, like you just kind of talked about, the range of different stones and how some mentioned baseball, some didn't. I think the one that I found most delightful, though, was probably Effa Manley's, who just simply said she loved baseball. Which I think probably describes each of us that are here participating today. Did you have a particular stone or memorial or marker that you thought kind of, I don't know, was profound or something that stuck out?
That was profound. I mean, I really, I talked about it today, but I love Hulbert's. I love the foundational cities being on that big baseball. That was a favorite of mine. Gosh. There's something very profound in the simplicity of Martin de Higo's grave. Most of the folks in Cuba uses the ossuary practice of burial. When you are buried, you're buried in this above ground crypt. And then once you've turned to dust, they take your bones out and they put them in this tiny little box, and then they reuse that space for someone else. Because, Cuba's small, a lot of the Latin American countries do that just because you've got a space issue, right? And Dihigo is in a permanent structure. His above ground crypt has been covered in tiles so that it's impossible to just open him up and remove him. So there's a permanence to his grave in Cuba, unlike most other graves that you see there, that is telling in terms of the level of respect that they have for him. He is universally considered in Cuba by Cuban ball players as the best Cuban to ever play the game, and they're probably right. So the fact that in this culture where the practice is usually this temporary set of stages where you get moved from one to the next, to see Dihigo in something that's more permanent that stuck with me for sure.
It looks like we have 2 last-minute questions here. The first from Bill Nolan. What's the gold record on your wall?
It is Abbey Road.
Oh, you've got quite a selection of Abbey Road on the wall.
Yes, indeed.
And Ryan Schroer asks about memorable reactions from living Hall of Famers and kind of what they thought about your project.
One of my favorites was actually Don Sutton. He was doing an appearance the same day as I think it was Jim Palmer, and he heard me doing the elevator pitch to Jim Palmer. And I made it clear to the living guys that it did include the dead guys. They knew the full scope of the project. And most of the time, like I said, the guys just sort of took the picture and moved on. Don Sutton, after overhearing me describe what the project was to Jim Palmer, told the baseball card show promoter that before he agreed to take the photograph, he wanted to give me a brief competency hearing. He wanted to make sure that I was not a dangerous lunatic. So he did. He asked me like a good 5 or 6 questions that were basically like, questions based around my sanity, which I loved. I thought that was hilarious. That was how that one turned out. Reggie Jackson was fun too. It didn't make the book, and I wish the picture didn't make the book. I didn't get to keep the picture. His manager deleted it. But when I asked Reggie to take the picture, he took the ball in hand, and I wish I had a ball here to show you. But he took the ball in hand and he held it like this, and he's like, "You want this? Is this the picture you want?" And I took the picture, and I was like, "Yes, that is definitely the picture I want," because nothing says Reggie Jackson more than that. But his manager insisted that I delete it, and we took a second one, and that was the one I got to keep. So
yeah, nice bookend with old Haas in the middle finger, right? Thank you so much for doing this again, Ralph. What would be the best way for people that don't have your book yet to go ahead and get it?
if you would like to buy my book, you can reach out to me either via Twitter, and I have the very radical Twitter notion of just having a handle that is my name. So you can find me at Ralph Carhart, or you can shoot me an email at thehallballproject @gmail.com. Sorry it's so long. Someone had already taken the hallball@gmail.com. I don't know who, but the hallballproject@gmail.com. If you shoot me an email to that, I will more than happy to sign one and send it off to you. I still have about half of those 80 copies that I bought when I was hoping to do signings sitting in my house. So I'm more than happy for those to go away.
Excellent. Thanks, Ralph. Appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you all for having me. I had a lot of fun talking to everybody, and it was great seeing the folks that I have met in the past. Thanks for coming.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, Ralph.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Great. Thank you, everybody in Chicago, for doing this.
Yeah.
Nice job, John.
Hey, thanks. This was a lot of fun.